Since his doctoral dissertation and even before, he has dedicated himself towards unraveling the dynamic psychosocial orientation of varied social processes unfolding in the society around. Through his influential research endeavors, Sir highlighted key applications of social identity theory to understand the varied concepts, including violence, political leadership, intergroup relations, academic achievement, stereotype threat, motivation, just to mention a few. His research in the field of social psychology, research methods, statistics, and educational psychology have marked distinguished places in reputed journals, including Psychological Studies, European Journal of Psychology and Educational Studies, Journal of Social and Political Psychology, American Journal of Orthopsychiatry, and many more. Amongst his other significant achievements and contributions to the academic world, Sir has written 8 book chapters, over 9 invited book reviews, and edited over 8 book volumes published in the very prestigious Oxford University Press, Orient Black Swan, and Primus. In addition, Sir has supervised 5 PhD and 15 MPhil dissertations. And a very important and an additional recognition to his credit has been the successful completion of a joint project, Boundary, Barriers, and Bridges, sponsored by ICSSR, being so impactful that it fetched an additional international collaboration under the UGC UK India Education and Research Initiative Joint Research Program on social identity, well-being, collective participation among social and ethnic groups in India. Sir has been very closely associated with our department and have always made himself available on our requests. He has actively contributed to our departmental book reading club and gave our students unique insights to book analysis. We thank you again, sir, for having agreed to share your valuable and key insights on critical psychology, its scope and significance. Now, may I kindly request Professor Mishra to take over.
Thank you, Divya, for very kind words. I do not know whether I will be able to come up to the expectation.
We are very sure, sir.
Yeah, I joined this meeting when earlier session was going on. So there was no break. Generally, we have habit of taking break. So for me, there is no problem, but for participant, namaskar. For participant, you have to excuse me because I am not responsible for this organization of session, various sessions. But
so
anyway,
we are sure it will all be
anyway, I think that this is your 3rd day or 2nd day of lecture.
Day,
fourth day. Because during inaugural first day, I was present, and first 2 days I could not attend. But later on, I think I watched video lecture of Professor Ramadhar Singh, a renowned professor from whom I have learned a lot. But when you learn a lot from your teacher and from your guru, sometimes you dare to differ also. And I think credit also goes to guru. If teacher or students or disciple try to oppose or try to differ, try to contradict some of their thinking. So if I differ from Professor Ramadhar Singh or from some senior faculty member who will be talking to you or who have already talked to you, I think this confidence I have gained because of them and because of their own training. And of course, they have also trained me to read new books, to update myself with the latest things that is going on in psychology. As it has been announced that today the topic which I shall be covering, it is critical psychology, its scope and relevance. Now, what is critical psychology? Unlike other branches of psychology such as social psychology, clinical psychology, organizational psychology, personality psychology. So these are the various components of psychology, but they are not fundamentally different from one another. They are different from one another in terms of content, in terms of subject matter, but they are not different from one another in terms of the approaches to look at psychology and the way they understand psychology. But critical psychology is, one can say, it is an alternative to psychology or alternative to mainstream psychology or official psychology. What do we mean by mainstream psychology? Psychology which we have learned through textbook, and psychology which we teach our student, we practice, is mainstream psychology. So most of us have been trained in mainstream psychology, official psychology, and APA, which is apex body of psychology, propagates. It has also institutionalized this mainstream psychology. So psychology, which we consider as official or academic psychology, it is just one version of psychology. I would like to introduce a concept, psychology with capital P and psychology with small p. Now, what is difference between psychology with capital P and psychology with small p? By virtue of being human being, we all have capacity to understand each other's mental state, each other's emotion, their intention, their motivation. No, in formal psychology also, we call it theory of mind. Because of, we all have theory of mind, and because of that capacity of theory of mind, in normal life, the person who are not trained in psychology, who may not be even educated, whom we call illiterate, but they are able to conduct themselves and they are able to negotiate in social world because of having this faculty to read and to understand each other's mind. So this awareness about person's psychology, I call it psychology with small p. And psychology with capital P is a psychology which is official psychology, that is treasured in psychology textbook, that is created, that is preserved in psychology textbook, in their journals, by their academic association, by teaching, by research. Ideally, psychology with small p and psychology with capital P, they should converge. They should have been identical. But empirically, psychology with small p and psychology with capital P are different. There is a gap between them. Now, let's try to think about psychology with the small p. Psychology with the small p is something that we all have our psychological state by virtue of being human being, and by virtue of being human being, we have capacity to understand each other's psychology. How do we learn? How do we gain this capacity? Partly we can attribute it to our neurological system, but partly because of our culture, because of our society. We all are socialized by our society to be a member of society, and every society has a cultural code. So something which we can learn and we can uh, know intuitively by virtue of being a member of a cultural group or by virtue of being member of a society, which person from other social group or person from other social group will find it difficult or sometimes can misunderstand also. From anthropology, we know that, and also from cross-cultural psychology, that people have different way of behaving, different way of knowing things, and different way of feeling motivated. Uh, some of you may be aware of this article, a great article that was published in 1991 by Marcus and Kitayama, that was published in important APA journal, Psychological Review, and authored by two important psychologists, Hazel Marcus and Sunoi Kitayama. The title of the article was Culture and Self, Implication for cognition, emotion, and motivation. An author argued in that paper that in basically in two kinds of world, he says that Western world and non-Western world, and he uses the concept self-construal. By self-construal, they mean the way we understand ourselves. And they argue that people in non-Western world understand themselves differently the way people in Western world understand themselves. Means self-construal of people from Western world is different from the self-construal of people from non-Western world. And if that is so, the second part of his title, that is implication for cognition, emotion, and motivation. So all three important mental processes, cognition, emotion, and motivations, are linked with self-construal. So if self-construal of two worlds, Western world and non-Western world, are different, so by implication, cognition, emotion, and motivation of people from these two different worlds will also differ. Now, what do we teach our student in class when we introduce psychology, especially general psychology at undergraduate level? Psychology is scientific study of human behavior. Sometimes we call behavior, sometimes we call mental processes also. I think we should be inclusive. When we say only behavior, so it reflects influence of behaviorism on the definition of psychology. We should also remember that there cannot be one definition or single definition of psychology. It depends also how do we look at psychology, from which school we look at psychology. So if you look at psychology from behavioristic perspective, naturally you will bring or will give focus on behavior. But if you take other schools, accordingly you will be giving focus to. So in psychology, we do not have any kind of consensus. But when we say that psychology is the scientific study, and in what way we use the science, because unfortunately, in textbook, either there is no elaboration on what is scientific method, or there are certain characteristics about scientific method which is highly outdated understanding about scientific method. I would like to share with you, I do not know how far you have read it, but a new subdiscipline has emerged and has become very, very important nowadays for social science and for natural science also, and that is called philosophy of science. Philosophy of science is not exclusive domain of philosopher only. Philosophy of science is very, very relevant for social scientists and also for natural scientists, those who deal with, those who engage with scientific method. Now, what is scientific method? What is science? There is not one meaning of science. Even in the field of science, all stalwarts of science, they they debate among themselves, but at high school level, we have done, because science is one of the paper which is compulsory, an image that is portrayed to a student that science is a body of knowledge about which there is 100% consensus. So there are law, Newton's law, there are law of motion, there are law of principle of thermodynamics, now theory of electromagnetism, and it is taught as something which is sacrosanct, which is unassailable, which is accepted by everybody, and there is no doubt about it. I think this is not reality about science. Those who are in the field of science, they know that scientists differ among themselves as much as psychologists and other scholars differ among themselves about their own discipline. What we know as science and the image of science that is portrayed to a student as a body of knowledge where there is no debate and everything is objectively decided and it is perfect knowledge, it is not true. I remember Professor Ramadhar Singh mentioned one name, important name, Thomas S. Kuhn. And Kuhn, who was originally a physicist, but later on he developed interest in history of science and philosophy of science. And he wrote a seminal book that was published in 1962. The name of the book was Structure of Scientific Revolution. What did he do in that book? It's a seminal book. After publication of that book, our understanding about science has been revolutionized. And people in science, uh, many people in science do not know about this book. And what is the important message of this book? Kuhn has popularized the term paradigm, about which Professor Ramadhar Singh said. Now, what is paradigm? Uh, Even that is very difficult to define, because Thomas Kuhn in same book has used word paradigm in 21 different senses. So even Kuhn was not very clear what does he mean by paradigm. But broadly by paradigm, he referred two things. One, that way of doing science, the way you do science, and in second sense, exemplar of science, some work which you have done. Like in psychology, Bartlett study. So this is what one can say, that this is one paradigm of psychology. Or from social psychology, you can say Zimbardo studies. Or uh, you can say Robert Cave's study on intergroup relation, or Tasfel's study. So some of the important study which are known as exemplar of science. In physics also, they are in all disciplines are there. Now, by paradigm, and Professor Ramadhar Singh also told that scientists uh, develop, because of their socialization, some consensus among themselves without much articulating, without much explicating how to go about science. So they develop some kind of consensus through socialization, not by using some kind of logic. So one who gets admission in Department of Physics or in Department of Chemistry, what he or she learns from teacher. These are the topics of physics, these are the topics of chemistry, and there is hardly any discussion. Why do we study this topic in physics and not any other topic? We don't ask. I think this kind of questions are not encouraged. Even in psychology, so undergraduate students, they are given a syllabus, there is a textbook, and you say that first topic is definition of psychology, second is method of psychology, then learning, attention, thinking, memory, and everything. Everything is pre-decided. Do we discuss, do we allow our student that why these topics are psychology? What constitutes psychology? Who decides this is psychology and anything else is not psychology? No, it is not done. So there is a institutional force that have already decided, and they also decide how to go about psychological research. And nobody asks why we do research, why do we do survey, why do we do case study. We are simply taught that these are the methods that are used for psychological research, and you should do that. Nobody tells us why we should do that. Thomas Kuhn says that these are conventional rules. So what are the conventional rules? Rules which are unsaid, which are not explicitly taught in any academic institution, which are learned through process of socialization by virtue of being member of an academic community, conventional rule. And what is simply taught in any academic institution is the rational rule. So rational rule, how to calculate value of mean, how to calculate measures of dispersion, standard deviation, or variance, or mean deviation, how to calculate the value of correlation, how to find whether this value is significant at 0.05 level or not. These are taught, but so one part of rule that are not taught, remains unsaid, remains tacit, are conventional rule. And Thomas Kuhn says that members of scientific community share this conventional rule, and all those members who share this conventional rule, they constitute a community of psychology, and this is what is paradigm. So they look at things in one way. So if we believe, we do not question why we teach this thing in psychology and why we study psychology this way, if we accept uncritically, because we have respect for our academic institution, we have respect for the books, because we tend to be guided by this belief that what is written in the book cannot be wrong. I think this is true. We all think that things written, and moreover, we are a colonized, ex-colonized country, so we have more faith if things are written in English and written by some foreign author. We may have some doubt if Indian authors write, but something is written by foreign authors, we hardly cast aspersion on that. But I can give example that many things, there are a lot of confusion about many things among top scholars also. Although there is no scope, on one occasion I have talked about in Ramanujan College, statistics which is taught as essential course. And we all use in statistics p-value, small p, 0.05 and 0.01. We do not understand meaning of p correctly. And most of us use it wrongly. And not only in India, even in foreign country like Germany, where, and it is understood wrongly by teachers who teach statistics in the Department of Psychology in foreign university. So please do not entertain this idea that whatever foreigners do is correct and there is no space in their version of psychology or in their practice to finding any fault. This is not true. But I am saying this is our way of thinking, that we think that there is no problem in that. So I was coming to this, the paradigm. So Kuhn says, and that argument is very important for psychology, that in science also, he was first developing this thesis in the context of science, that scientists learn through socialization, not through any rational rule, through conventional rule, to know what are the subject matter of science and how to study them. This they learn through conventional rule, which they do not question, which they accept as a matter of faith. And that's how paradigm developed. But Kuhn says that within a paradigm, scientists practice science. They do research, and paradigmatic research, this research which is conducted within a paradigm, it helps them for some time. But after some time, they start getting some evidence, some finding, which cannot be explained within that paradigm. I will give you example from physics, because physics is considered to be the perfect model of science. In fact, one of the historian of psychology, whose name is Thomas Leahy, who has written a book on history of psychology, Thomas Leahy says that psychologists suffer from anxiety, which is called one envy, physics envy. So psychologists try to or strive to emulate physics the way physicists do physics, but psychologists are not able to do that. Although they dream to give some kind of law, the way Newton has given a law of motion, law of gravitation. Similarly, in psychology, we have psychophysics, but after that, we do not have any kind of law. And that is not going to be possible also. And I will give you reason for that. So physics becomes the model of science. That is a perfect science which can be done. But in the beginning of 20th century, so till 300 years, Newton ruled over scientific world. What is science? Everything was said by Newton. So a very important scientist, Max Planck, when he was a school student and very bright student, so after his school, he wanted to decide about his future career. So his well-wisher said that do not go for physics. And why? Because in physics, there is no career. Everything has been already discovered by Newton. So for you, there is nothing to discover. So you go to a field where there is a chance of discovery. So this was the weight of Newtonian scholarship, that people believed that about physical world, everything has been discovered by Newton. And the knowledge that has been created by Newtonian physics is the perfect knowledge. And that knowledge was accepted by physicists for 300 years. But in the beginning of 20th century, Albert Einstein comes in the scene, and he first proposes his special theory of relativity. We all know about Einstein, that he got Nobel Prize, and we associate always Einstein with theory of relativity, but he did not get Nobel Prize for theory of relativity. He got Nobel Prize for his work on photoelectric effect. And why he did not get Nobel Prize for theory of relativity? Because he did not find any, could not give any experimental proof. And Nobel Committee people are as conservative as psychologists are, that they say that, or they believe that unless there is an experimental proof, there cannot be a physics. Whereas Einstein in his life never believed in, and he was so confident about his theory. So when somebody said that if experimental data proves that your theory is wrong, what will you do? Professor Einstein, he said that I will say that experimental data is wrong and you have to conduct experiment differently. My theory cannot be wrong. So he was so he had intuition about the physical world. So what is important thing that Einstein came and he proposed completely different. So he says that in Newtonian theory, notion of space is absolute. Notion of mass is absolute. Notion of time is very absolute. What he did, he relativized it. And we all know that whether we are in position of static or in dynamic state, so if we are on a moving train and somebody is observing us from the moving train, will appear as static. But somebody who is standing on the static surface and will observe me who is moving in a moving train, then I will appear as a moving person. So it is frame of reference. Concept of frame of reference is very important. From which frame of reference you are observing. And after Einstein, then in the beginning of 20th century, quantum physics also emerged. And Professor Ramadhar Singh also very briefly mentioned one name, if you remember, Werner Heisenberg, uncertainty principle. And in uncertainty principle, it is said that a physicist or researcher cannot determine two things together, position and momentum. So if you determine the momentum of a particle, you cannot be sure about the position. And if you can be sure about the position, you cannot be sure about the momentum. So this is, and another thing, what happened, basically two great physicists, Albert Einstein and Niels Bohr, who got Nobel Prize back to back. So in 1921, Einstein got Nobel Prize, and in 1922, Niels Bohr got Nobel Prize for physics. And they were discussing about the fundamental nature of reality. That what is this world consists, we have been taught in our high school that this world consists of matter. And matter exists in three states or four states: solid, liquid, gas, and plasma. And this matter consists of molecules. Molecule consists of atoms. Atom consists of some atomic particle, electron, proton, neutron. And now particle physicists will say that. But the very word atom, please remember, it consists of an English word tom, T-O-M, which means to split. And when we say atom, which cannot be split. So belief was that a particle which cannot be further split is atom. That is the ultimate building block. So physicists were trying to determine what is the building block, fundamental building block of this universe. So some experimental evidence will point out that It consists of wave. So wave travels not in a straight line, but it is continuous. And another experiment will point out that fundamental building blocks are in terms of quanta, photons consist of discrete particles. They are not continuous like wave. They are discrete, separate from one another. So two contradictory findings coming from experimental evidence about the fundamental nature of reality. And there was no way to resolve this because it is said, and Professor Ramadhar Singh also said, that whenever you have unresolved issue, you try to do research and try to resolve that problem. So it was great unresolved issue in the field of physics regarding the fundamental nature of reality. And they could not. So Einstein and Bjorn Borg could not agree on that. So Werner Heisenberg made very interesting statement, and that is relevant for us, and which Professor Ramadhar Singh also said, that what we perceive is not reality per se, but reality exposed through our method of investigation. What we do in psychology or in any subject, in any empirical science, be it psychology, physics, chemistry, biology, wherever we make observation, either in experimental condition or natural condition, or we try to take some kind of data, but all are observations about. So what we observe, very innocently psychologists believe, because psychologists do not understand, do not have idea about latest development in science itself. They are like a parrot. So if you teach parrot that hunter will come and do not get into its trap, so parrot will remember, but and will speak same thing that hunter will come and we should not get trapped into that, but finally we'll get trapped into that. Psychologists are like parrot. They do not understand about science. And if they know about science, their knowledge of science is highly outdated. Their knowledge of science is Newtonian notion of science, whereas science has progressed a lot, in last more than 100 years. I said that sub-discipline philosophy of science. So one of the contribution in the emergence of philosophy of science have come from physics and theoretical physics. So another thing that comes from quantum physics itself, that when we observe, when we make observation, even in the field of physics, it is said that the moment you start making observation, the act of observation changes the thing you are trying to observe. For example, if there is an object in front of me, any object, suppose object A, and I am trying to understand it. And in order to understand it, I have to observe it. Observation is the basic process. Only then you can measure it or you can understand it. But according to quantum physics itself, the very act of observation changes the nature of thing which is being observed, which means nobody can observe thing in its original form, in its raw form. Okay, so from there, notion from observation, they say it is participation. So there is always interaction between observer and the observed. Observer and observed are not separate. They constitute a reality. It is a relational reality. Now in psychology, some people have learned, now instead of calling sample, we call sometimes participant. They are our participant, but we do not call ourselves as participant. No? But in psychology, we have a concept, Rosenthal effect. I hope some of you have heard in 1960s, late 60s and early 70s, important psychologist Rosenthal, he demonstrated that experimental can influence, not can influence, does influence the data which he or she is trying to collect. Because in psychological experiment, we do conduct experiment on human being, and experimenter is also a human being. And although we, no, again, very like a small child, we become very naive. All psychologists are naive. We believe that in experimental condition, our subject, no, do not think anything else and will only focus on what we say. It never happens. What is reality basically? When you call a human being inside your laboratory, person is puzzled because it is very difficult to stop anybody from thinking, whether person is educated or not educated. Nature has endowed everybody to think. So thinking is something which is unstoppable. No person can stop anybody else's thinking. And the more you try to stop somebody's thinking, there will be more effort on the part of person to think. Even there has been research. If you try to suppress your own thought, it is one of the classic studies done in 1989, thought suppression. So if you try to suppress your own thought, you will always fail, and your effort to suppress your own thought will lead to more thinking. Same thing happens with the subject also. So what they do, they try to figure out why I have come to this lab and what does this gentleman or gentlewoman, lady, trying to do. So your subject is trying to figure out, and whether rightly or wrongly, person figure out something, okay, and accordingly will adjust one's response. So if person thinks, so even though you have not told your hypothesis, that what is your problem, what is the hypothesis you are trying to test, but person will on his own will try to figure out what you are trying to do, and person will come up with some kind of idea that this is what you are trying to do, and based on that idea your subject will alter or adjust his or her response. Technically in psychology we call it demand characteristics, which is one of the source of threat to internal validity of experiment. Similarly, experimenters also influence unconsciously by your physical presence, because of your dress, because of the what kind of English you speak, how you appear to them. So it is difficult. We say that experiment is conducted under controlled condition, but experimental effect cannot be controlled and demand characteristic cannot be controlled. So our data, our whatever observation we take, it is far from being uncontaminated. All observation, all psychological data consist of two parts at least, which is accepted also by even traditional psychologists: true score plus error score. Okay. Now, conventional psychologists will say that error score, we can measure what is the amount of error, but that is a different debate altogether. But why did I bring this issue? That in physics, I said that paradigm. Uh, so after emergence of Einsteinian physics and quantum physics, Newtonian physics was partly replaced, and physicists started considering that all knowledge based on Newtonian physics are very, very limited in its scope. It works, it can predict only when speed of the object is less than c. And what is c in physics? Speed of light. But if speed of object, if it is close to the speed of light, then Newtonian physics, Newtonian law does not work. It cannot predict. And Newtonian physics works when it is a gross kind of object. But if you are dealing with subatomic particle, Newtonian physics does not work. It fails. In physics now, scholars have even gone ahead of that, and we have a physics, we call it chaos physics. In chaos physics, in very simple term, I can explain it, that if butterfly flutters, So it is a very, very micro kind of movement, fluttering of by butterfly. But what would be its impact on the environment? Its impact may be nothing, negligible, and it may lead to a storm also. Means it goes against the insight that we have got from Newtonian physics. In Newtonian physics, the amount of force you have applied. So in order to flutter, the wings, butterfly applies some kind of force, and we can measure that force also. But its impact sometimes would be negligible, and sometimes it may be a causation of a storm. And this is what chaos physics says. So there is no one-to-one correspondence. One cannot predict effect by measuring the cause. Our entire psychology, experimental psychology and quantitative psychology, is based on this belief that we can measure stimulus variable, we can measure called independent variable. We have been taught how to manipulate the value of independent variable, and we can see its effect on dependent variable. But in entire experiment, the subject, human being, their intention, their meaning making capacity, their social class, they are not talked about. So scientific psychology is hardly scientific. Although we take pride, person like Professor Ramadhar Singh, who is a great scholar, undoubtedly, whose achievement is laudable, but they have been socialized and trained in scientific psychology, which is outdated scientific psychology. And I can make this bold statement that the current practice in psychology, scientific psychology, is not in tune with development in the field of science itself. So Fritjof Capra, who is a physicist and who wrote a very important book, The Turning Point, which you can remember, and if you get chance, you can read that. And there is a chapter in his book, and he has titled that chapter as Newtonian Psychology. And what does he mean by Newtonian psychology? So he has argued in that chapter that entire scientific psychology is based on Newtonian model of physics, which is a outdated model of physics. This is a statement not by me, by one of the greatest physicists of 20th century. It is Newtonian psychology. So in the name of scientific psychology, we are doing Newtonian psychology. We cannot say it is. Now, what is scientific psychology? When I say critical psychology, so by critical psychology, we mean that we should not take anything for granted. So we should not even accept the conventional rule. We should teach our student from first day to question everything, the topic, the paper, why we teach this topic in general psychology and another topic in social psychology and third topic in personality psychology. Even that students should be allowed to question, and we should also question. Do we do that? I think this happens in all disciplines, that there is a force of organization. APA is very powerful. No, we being from ex-colonial country, in order to be sure about our own scholarship, we want to publish in a APA journal. Unless your paper is published in APA journal or BPS journal, British Psychological Society journal, you will not be considered a top quality scholar. And if somebody is introduced that he or she has been able to publish in APA journal, so undoubtedly person is a good psychologist. So we seek confirmation from them, and they maintain certain kind of psychology. Now, branch of psychology, and I would give very good reference to you to read. Name of the book is Critical Psychology, an Introduction. It is introductory book, very good book, written by Fox and Priletensky. Dennis Fox and Isaac Preletinsky. Uh, these authors argue in his book, Critical Psychology, that mainstream psychology is status quoist. Now, what is status quoist psychology? What do we mean by status quoist psychology? Every society, and in world also, we have a social structure. In social structure, we have some kind of hierarchy. There are class, there are caste, there are racial group, and they are related to one another in power relationship. So in US context, we have white and we have black. And we know this, although US will claim uh, herself as champion of democracy, will say that they are one of the greatest democracy. And in democracy, there is a equality, but there is hardly any equality in US context. Not only in US, there is no society in this world which is equal. All societies in the world, and not only today, even in the past, historically also, they have been unequal. So inequality is the hallmark of all social society in the world. And knowledge, which we consider very sacrosanct, education is considered to be one of the positive things. It can liberate people. But in sociology, we have a subdiscipline called sociology of education. And from sociology of education, we have learned that education is not necessarily an emancipatory force. It does not emancipate individual. It does not emancipate even society. One function that is done by education and by implication by knowledge also, that it reproduces social hierarchy. So there is a hierarchy in society. We believe, and some of the philosophers of education like John Dewey also believed that through education we can democratize society. And he wrote a book, Democracy and Education, that became very important in the beginning of 20th century. But empirically, John Dewey's prediction proved to be wrong. Although education has spread, literacy rate has gone up in most of the society. But if you examine some data, contemporary data, you will find that social inequality is on rise. In human history, there has never been so much of inequality which we find today. Uh, if you have heard name of a famous economist, Thomas Piketty, and who wrote a book, Capital in 21st Century. It is one of the seminal books. Economists talk a lot about, even non-economists, some of them have read this book. And by taking data of last 150 years, he has shown systematically how social inequality are basically, for some time it reduced, but now after 1980s, it is rising. So education does not reduce social inequality. Knowledge does not. So sociology analysis that is provided, offered by sociology of education is correct, that education consolidates, it reinforces, it reproduces social inequality which already exists. Okay. Psychology also produces a kind of knowledge. And we should ask very important question, the knowledge which has been produced by psychologists, which we call psychological knowledge in various branches of APA has now 57, 58, something like that. So great amount of knowledge. But can we ask very simple question? It is fine that psychology has diversified a lot. Now we have very powerful academic body, very important journal, sophisticated journal. But what is impact of psychological knowledge on society? according to the analysis provided by Fox and Preletinsky in this book, Critical Psychology, that psychological knowledge tries to justify the status quo, social status quo. So, as I told you, that social status quo is that in every society, there are groups and they stand in power and status relationship, and that relationship is unequal. So psychological knowledge, like all other knowledge, reinforces, legitimizes, reproduces social inequality. Now, in clinical psychology, let me come to, because people are in awe of clinical psychology. Many young students are drawn to clinical psychology. No, they have very nice intention. I have no doubt about their intention. But I'm talking about that if we ourselves are very naive, then we cannot expect our student to be very critical in their consciousness. Many psychological problems, which we call psychiatric problem or mental problem, are correlated with social structure and social inequality. It has many scholars have written about it, so I have no time to go into detail. But what is our belief that guides our thinking in clinical psychology and our practice in clinical psychology? What we do, a problem which has origin in society, so I will call it sociogenic origin. But a problem which is sociogenic by nature is understood as individual genic nature. We individualize, and some people prefer to call it psychologize. So not necessarily psychological problems are individual problems. Another belief that guides our thinking and practice in clinical psychology, that mental problems indicate some kind of lack of competence on the part of whether you call client or patient to deal with stress. Means we all have stress in our life. Some people who are able to cope with those stress, they are not called to suffer from mental problem. But those who suffer from mental problem means their coping capacity is less than the amount of stress that is inflicting upon them. That is our understanding. Means some kind of lacuna, some kind of lack, some kind of deficit on the part of individual. So we blame individual. Basically, in a society which is unequal and very few, minuscule people own resources. So in Indian condition, maybe less than 5% people own resources on, I think, 90% of the resources. And the rest of the 95% of people have to manage with 10% of resources. And the story is more or less same in other countries also. And it's not only about economic resources, but economic resources are very much related with the social resources and political resources. So a large number of people are at receiving end. They are at disadvantageous position in terms of not having access to economic, social, political, cultural resources. So they are a victim of social system. They are victim of social structure, social arrangement. What do psychologists do? Clinical psychologists and practitioners of psychology, they blame the victim, blaming the victim, rather than blaming the actual culprit who are responsible for inequality and perpetuation of inequality in society. We blame the victim and we think that we are helping, we are in helping position. I will call the profession of clinical psychology as safety valve. What kind of safety valve is this? That it is a social system which is unjust social system, which is unequal social system, and you create this impression that no, we advance and we support some kind of helping profession to cope people with their problem. So you are not inhuman being. No, in 17th century and 18th century, there used to be very inhuman treatment whenever somebody would suffer from mental problem. Now our treatment has become more human. It is a safety, but because of the profession of clinical psychology and counseling psychology, the person who suffer from so-called who are sufferer, and my belief is that they do not suffer from mental problem, they suffer from problem which is sociogenic in nature, but society convinces person to think that it is their psychological problem. So victims are not able to question the social system. So psychology in that way is a regressive discipline. It does not help society. Had there not been discipline like psychology and this kind of profession, which is also called helping profession, at least a victim could have come together, which Karl Marx said long back in his thesis, that workers of the world unite and you have nothing to lose except your chain. No, because you are chained by the capitalist. So in this social system which is unequal, you are a sufferer. But this uh, uh, I think aristocratic kind of science, psychology, is preventing the generation and development of critical consciousness among the masses. One of the aim of critical psychology. So critical psychology uh, does not clearly oppose a psychological practice, but it definitely opposes a psychological practice which conceptualize psychological problem in terms of individual problem and which also aims at solving the problem at individual level. So critical psychology will consider all the so-called psychological problem as a social problem. And remedy is to change the social system rather than changing the individual. That is one thing. So in that way, community psychology, some of you may have read community psychology. There are, I think, various versions of community psychology. There is community mental health. So you have to understand difference between individual-based clinical psychology, community health, and community psychology. One book which I read when I was master student by Julian Rappaport, written by community psychology. And she has written a sentence which I still remember, that where this book ends, real community psychology begins from there. Although I found that book at that time quite progressive, quite ahead of its time, but even then, Julian Rappaport says that real community psychology. So, message of community psychology is not to do traditional practice of clinical psychology in community setting. I think this is the message which is given, which is an incorrect message about community psychology. This is not community psychology. Community psychology is a radical approach to look at the human problem and social problem, and also to deal with radically. Another issue, let me take, that when we say scientific psychology, some of you may be interested in feminist approach to psychology. Feminist psychology is not only about women. There is difference between the feminist epistemology and psychology about women and psychology from the perspective of women are two different things. One can study women from mainstream psychology perspective. One can study women, and women have been so far studied from scientific psychology perspective. And if you look at some of the findings which are awful. Women are portrayed in very poor light. They are considered deficient in some of the mental activities. They are cognitively not as good as men are. They are considered emotional and less rational. And by calling them emotional, that they are not able to deal with reality in a realistic manner. So in some, feminist psychologists say that women have been studied wrongly, and their image has been portrayed very poorly because of scientific psychology. So feminist approach to psychology does not support the use of scientific method in psychology. Their charge, their criticism of scientific psychology is that scientific method helps patriarchal system to stay. Scientific method legitimizes patriarchy. Scientific psychology also proves that women are essentially inferior. Essentially inferior. That's why feminist psychology can be both men and women. They are against the use of scientific. Even many psychologists who represent minority group like Black, Hispanic, Latino, in Indian context you can say Dalit, they find that by using scientific method, their group have been portrayed in a very, very poor light. So what do we need? We need a different approach to psychology. During 1970s, in Latin America, a new movement started. In the field of education, a very important scholar contributed. Some of you might be knowing his name, Paulo Freire. And he wrote a book which is considered a classic, Pedagogy of the Oppressed. And around same time, a psychologist from Latin America, Martin Barrow, and he started a movement in psychology, which is called liberation psychology. In Latin America, it is quite popular, but in India, we follow only US, UK, Canada, Australia, not even France and Germany. We hardly know French psychologist, German psychologist, and Norwegian psychologist. So our exposure to psychology is quite narrow. Psychology is like a game which dominant psychologists play. An article was published in 2010, and which says that the mainstream psychology which we are doing is weird psychology. And weird is an acronym which stands for westernized, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic. So most of the psychological theories which have been developed by psychologists have come from undergraduate students who are studying in US university system. And who are these students? They come from middle class. They are white, mostly men. So our psychology is weird, and weird population is less than 5% of the world population. But because of its economic dominance and political dominance at world scenario, American psychology is projected as a universal psychology. And science helps American psychology in this endeavor, because science is supposed to give a universal knowledge. It is not a local knowledge. So in physics, you don't say that law of motion only applies in Chicago and not in Delhi and not in Vietnam. Similarly, by using the model of scientific psychology, you claim to produce a knowledge which is universal in nature and which is not bound by its local context. But that is not true. That is not true. It is only because of power. Now we have some theory, and one important philosopher from France, Michel Foucault, many of you know because he is a very popular person, and he has given a thesis, and which is accepted by majority of social scientists, that there is a connection between knowledge and power. So knowledge, which we consider, again innocently, that it mirrors objective reality, and science is value neutral. Foucault argues that science is value laden, and science exercises certain kind of power, and knowledge produced by science always favors those people who are in power, and it is used against those people who are powerless. Nowadays, many scholars have written the critique of science. No? So if we have to do and we have to understand critical psychology, we have to first understand the critique of science itself. And critique of science can be understood when we study sub-discipline called philosophy of science. So philosophy of science, according to my opinion and according to many senior psychologists' opinion, should be an essential course, preferably at master level, but definitely at doctoral level. Number one. Second, Ashish Nandi, who is one of the important Indian intellectual, I will say, he has got many uh, description. Some people call him political theorist, some people call him sociologist, some people call him psychologist. My first observation is that uh, I think Times Literary Magazine has rated him as one of the top 100 intellectual of 20th century. A rare recognition for Indian intellectual. In entire 20th century, he is among the top 100. But in Department of Psychology, Ashish Nandi is not known. Leave alone his work being discussed and taught. Ashish Nandi's one of the first book is titled as At the Edge of Psychology, EDGE. So he considers himself at the edge, not inside the psychology. Why? Because he finds, and I had privilege to interact with him on several occasions, and he found that psychology is a very narrow discipline, and you cannot do a meaningful thing by remaining the narrow confine of the discipline. And that's why he preferred to sit at the edge rather than being part of the group of psychology. He wrote another important book, and because of which he became an international scholar. And book is The Intimate Enemy. And this book is basically psychology of colonialism. Okay. Now, what is psychology of colonialism? We all were part of colonized group. Means our ancestors we were not born at that time, but our country was colonized. And when Britishers came, they soon realized that they cannot rule over this country only by using weapons, military, and police force. So they had to create a colonial knowledge and through which they wanted to rule us. And a very important anthropologist come historian, his name is Bernard Cohn. He's an American anthropologist come historian, and he wrote several books, but one of the book is An Anthropologist Among Historians. And he has done empirical study for 3 decades in UP. And he has shown how systematically colonial ruler distorted knowledge about our society, about our way of living, about our belief system. But because of their dominance, and not only political dominance or military dominance, but also intellectual dominance, we could not counter them. And psychology, which we are studying till today, is colonial.
Sorry, sir, you have muted yourself, sir.
So you have got muted.
Sorry. So Enlightenment, we know that in 18th century, Enlightenment took place in Europe, and they considered that Enlightenment is characterized by many kind of development of science and technology, development of secularism, development of nation state, development of modern education, now separation of polity from church, and new way of knowing and thinking. That was new for Europe itself. But because of modern education, now we have started thinking the way European also thinks. Okay? So way of knowing. And in philosophy, we use the term epistemology for that. So epistemologically, our psychology is based on Western epistemology. Same epistemology that was used by colonial master to distort knowledge about colonized society. You can read a book by a historian of science, Christine Hartneck. She came to India, stayed in our department where I am teaching now, and has shown that how British psychologists were using psychological theory to show that Indians are not psychologically mature and developed, like they are mama's boy. They are anxiety prone. So psychological knowledge were used as tools to portray colonized people in poor light and colonial master as superior human being, morally, intellectually. Although politically we are free, but psychology which we are using and doing and practicing and teaching is the same that were being taught before 1947. In terms of some topic, there may be change, but in terms of epistemology, there is no change. There is absolute continuity. Okay, so with this kind of psychology, there is hardly any hope for liberation. We may console ourselves, or sometimes we may self-congratulate, we are doing scientific psychology and doing great thing. But basically, by doing psychology, we are creating a prison to trap ourselves. So psychological knowledge, which is based on Western epistemology, traps us, and it a great hindrance in the path of emancipation, which does not mean I am asking for doing Indian psychology the way it is propagated. Even I do not agree with that. Indian psychology, which has emerged as a reaction against colonial psychology or Western psychology, is equally narrow. And psychology, which is done in India, cannot be called Indian psychology because it is a Western psychology being practiced on Indian people. It is hardly Indian in that sense. So what would be a true Indian psychology? It requires at least 7-day workshop. And I am not competent to throw light on all facets of that. People have to. So the basic message which I wish to convey, because time is almost up, that science is not a panacea. At least the way science is understood by psychology is a hindrance to do a meaningful psychology. In 1973, a very important social psychologist, Kenneth Gergen, he published a paper in important journal, APA journal, Journal of Personality and Social Psychology. And title of that paper was Social Psychology as History. Although he was talking about social psychology, but I think his argument is equally valid for all branches of psychology. That psychology has wrongly adopted the model of science. Rather, it should adopt the model of history. Now we have some new scholarship emerging, which is known as theoretical psychology also. I have been reading some work by a person like Thomas Teo, T-E-O, writing very copiously and very impressively. And he also says in one of the important articles, the title of this article is From Psychological Science to Psychological Humanities. So if psychology has to be meaningful, if it has to serve humanity, if it has to become emancipatory, it has to free itself from the shackle of science. Science is a kind of chain that has restricted the growth of psychology. Thank you.
Thank you so much, sir. I am literally falling short of words to actually thank you for providing us with such thought-provoking understanding and such thought-provoking ideas that it has actually made us, to start to think again that what actually are we doing, what actually are we understanding, and what more we really need to understand in order to really understand the influence and what the field of psychology is all about, and the vast reservoir of understandings that further could be generated by giving emphasis onto the Indian aspect and not just getting influenced by the westernized world. So I'm really grateful to you, sir, for having agreed to actually provide your key insights with us. Thank you so much, sir. I think we can take one or two questions if you allow, sir.
Yeah, more than two.
Okay, great, sir. So one of the participants has asked, can we say experiment also in a way not free from subjectivity? For example, the butterfly effect?
You know, you have raised very important question, but I do not know what do you mean by subjectivity. Generally, when we use the concept subjectivity, we are apologetic about that, that subjectivity is something inferior and objectivity is something desirable. I think we do not understand either the meaning of objectivity or subjectivity fully. If you are interested in this issue, because everything cannot be covered in one lecture, now Oxford University Press has brought out a series of short introduction, very small book, more than I think 600. And title of one such introduction is Objectivity. When we understand objectivity and subjectivity as antonyms of objectivity, I think it is a wrong understanding about subjectivity. There cannot be an objectivity without subjectivity. Subjectivity is the basis on which objectivity can be built. So any notion of objectivity divide the notion of because subjectivity is something nature has endowed us with. And without subjectivity, without the faculty of subjectivity, we cannot think of objectivity. By objectivity, if you mean that machine-like observation, the way camera records or the way any instrument records, a human being should stimulate. I think that is wrong. No? Only yesterday I was reading an article by an Harvard economist, Stephen Marlin. And in context of economics, he was writing, and that is relevant for psychology also. The knowledge which we create by using scientific method, he calls it algorithmic knowledge. And other kind of knowledge, which is not based on scientific method, but through our faculty and our interaction, we call experiential knowledge. He says that in science, people only rely on algorithmic knowledge and they completely ignore the experiential knowledge. And many common people only rely on experiential knowledge and they completely ignore algorithmic knowledge. In fact, the combination of two, and not just mechanical combination of two, but creative amalgamation of two kinds of knowledge, algorithmic knowledge and experiential knowledge, will give us a better understanding about reality. Professor Ramadhar Singh was saying in a different way by using the metaphor of 6 blind men trying to describe elephant. But I'm saying that it's not what part one is touching. I'm saying how you are knowing. No? So let me give you a reference, very important reference. A book was written by a very senior psychologist who is at Michigan University. His name is Richard Nisbett. And in 2003, he has written a book, Geography of Thought. And in that book, Richard Nisbett, based on many empirical studies, have argued and concluded that Western people and non-Western people think differently. And he says that in Western world, because of their different kind of socio-historical condition, their thinking is analytical thinking. And in non-Western world, because of different socio-historical circumstances, it is holistic thinking. And these are two different kind of thinking. And he has given an example which I can share with you. In multiple type of question, sometimes questions are asked that 3 or 4 items are given and we are asked to identify an odd item. So suppose items are given like cow, tiger, and grass. And we are asked to identify an odd item. So what one will identify? Someone will say grass, because cow and tiger are 4-footed animal. So they fall in the same category. So grass is odd item. But some people will identify tiger, and both are correct. Those who identify grass as odd item, their thinking is called categorical thinking. So they think that two objects which fall in same category, we categorize. So they are four-footed. So one feature we abstract from them. Whereas those who give tiger as an answer, they find cow is functionally related with grass. Cow eats grass. So there is a functional relationship between cow and grass. So in some socio-cultural ecology, functional relationship is encouraged. So, and it is based on empathy. It is not a just philosophical discussion. He's very, very renowned psychologist, still alive and active. So two way of thinking. So what we should realize that there cannot be only one way of thinking. So experiment makes us to think in one particular way. But we all should accept that this is one among many available options. And there are multiple other ways possible. Okay. Professor Ramadhar Singh admitted, but he said in a different context, that even Javed Akhtar knows psychology a lot. And it is correct. Harivansh Rai Bachchan, he was citing, great psychologist. But his mode was different. Even though I will give you example of Wilhelm Wundt, whom we consider founder of modern psychology or father of experimental psychology. But do you know what he had to say about experimental psychology? Wundt wrote only one book in experimental psychology. And after that, he realized limitation of experimental psychology. And he says that by using experimental method, we can only know simple elementary mental processes. However, in order to study complex higher mental processes, we have to use historical and anthropological method. And after that, he not only said this thing, last 20 years of his life, Wundt died in 1920. So from 1900 to 1920, he wrote on, in German it is written as Volker, but it is pronounced as folk psychology, which is translated as cultural psychology or social psychology. So Wundt, whom we consider father of scientific psychology, he understood limitation of experiment. And he very much showed importance of historical and anthropological method. And one of the important work that has been done on Wundt, I do not know because in Delhi University, some of you may have read, but at other places, his name is not known. Kurt Denziger. Kurt Denziger, he is a historian of psychology, and he's a critical historian of psychology, not like system of psychology, which is taught at undergraduate or postgraduate level. That is not history. The real history that has been done by only one person, Kurt Denziger, and the name of the book is Constructing the Subject. And in that book, Kurt Denziger argues that this subject could have been constructed in different ways. Means psychology could have taken many trajectories. Even his own disciple, Titchener, whom we teach, Titchener was much narrower as compared to Wundt. Wundt was interested in at least 4 areas: experimental psychology, child psychology, animal psychology, and cultural psychology. But Titchener, because of hostile situation he had to face in US context, in Cornell University, he became narrow. Not because of real training of, so Titchener, we either, no, Titchener and Wundt should not be put at same platform. Sometimes there is a misconception that Wundt is a structuralist. No, I think it is the wrong answer. Wundt was not a structuralist. Wundt was a psychologist. The term structuralism and functionalism were coined by Tichenor, when he was facing a hostile situation in US, to differentiate his version of psychology from American version of psychology. So he said that what I am doing is structuralist psychology, what Americans are doing is functionalist psychology. Wundt never used the term structuralism for his kind of psychology. And as we know that Tichenorian psychology was much narrower as compared to Wundtian psychology. So whether in experiment, and you will be surprised to know that Wundt himself used to act as subject in experiment. Now we think that only our student will be subject, and as a researcher, as a teacher, we will be experimental. But for Wundt, subject was as important as experimental. And in Wundt's time, in paper, name of both experimenter and subjects were published as author. And all these things have been brought to light by Kurt Denziger. So if you really want to understand the real psychology, which got lost sometimes, people didn't understand Wundt correctly. So they are saying that they are doing Wundtian psychology or scientific psychology, but they are doing disservice to Wundtian psychology.
Sir, thank you so much for such an insightful and session. It is always pleasure to listen you. And participants are asking about time. So we'd like to end this session now. And we request you again to, if you have time, then we request you again to deliver another lecture. And we will share, maybe we'll be sharing the particular date and time with you, because some participants asking that we need another session of Mishasha. So I share the same opinion. I would like you more in this session. So I think, would you like to take more question, or should we stop here? Dibya, what do you say?
So as sir says, and as you suggest, sir.
Yeah, there are some questions. I have no problem. I am sitting at home. I always enjoy interacting. So I have no problem. If participants are not hungry, I have no problem.
We can take one more question, Dibya. Okay?
Sure, sir. Sure, sir. Sure. So one of the questions that has been put up is that, sir, with due respect, changing a social system is not entirely easy and has to be done collectively. So isn't psychology in the present state helping in developing individual thought to contribute to this change?
Let me admit that I do not fully understand this question, but based on my understanding of your question, that may be a wrong understanding on my part. One of the charge leveled against psychology by Fox and Piletinsky, and by others also, that discipline of psychology is individualizing people. It is not natural about people to be individualistic. No? There is difference between individual and individualism. We are individual, but we are connected. We are connected in a society. But discipline of psychology assumes that center of all psychological processes are inside the human brain. So perception, motivation, memory, everything. So you have to look for answer here. So we have individualized psychology, and we are responsible for our psychology. But from anthropology, from literature, even from philosophy, history, we know that even Western society, which is highly individualistic nowadays, was not so individualistic. Okay, so there are many forces and factors that played important role in the individualization of Western society. But psychology as a discipline also contributed in legitimizing the ideology of individualism. But it's not that people are very happy. And let me share with you clinical observation of Sudhir Kakkar. Sudhir Kakkar, I hope you know, internationally renowned psychoanalyst. So half of the time he stays in India, half time he practices in Germany also. And in one of his articles, he made this observation that when I practice with my Indian client, so in their conscious life, they are collectivist, but in unconscious, they are individualistic. And about German client, he says that in their conscious life, they are individualistic, but in their unconscious life, they are collectivist, which means individualism and collectivism debate has been started by trendists in psychology, individualism and collectivism, and it is assumed that they are mutually exclusive. So a culture which is individualist cannot be collectivist and vice versa. But if we accept this observation, clinical observation of Sudhir Kakkar, means this element of individualism and collectivism coexist. In fact, two senior psychologists of India, Professor Durganand Sinha and Professor R.C. Tripathi, wrote very important article, and in which they have argued that this in India, among Indian psyche, individualism and collectivism coexist. Uh, but this ideology of individualism in West, why something becomes part of unconscious? Because it is not considered very desirable, which is not considered something no, uh, for which you will be given some kind of respect. So in Western context, socialization norm is that boys and girls around the age of 17 or 18, they have to decide to stay separately from their parents. No? And if they do not stay separately, it is a matter of concern for parent and for entire society. Because parent will also think that I have failed in socialization of my child, and that's why he or she is not able to live independently. So independence is a virtue. It is a no. Now, what is the scene? In Indian context, in same city, even if you are 50-year-old, and if you announce to your parent that now I want to live separately, if you are transferred in a different city, then you have legitimate reason. But suppose you are in Delhi and you have a sufficiently large house, no? So there is no constraint of space sufficient. So you can stay there. So there is no bahana, no excuse for staying separately. Now you say, parent will think, हाँ बहू ने आके अलग करवा दिया. Now he is not, no. So you have become selfish. So in Indian culture, individualism is still not very desirable. So it is cultural value, cultural orientation that encourages one tendency over the other. Now you said that society cannot be changed individually, but psychology is playing an opposite role by creating a consciousness of individualism, and not by creating a consciousness of individualism, but also by legitimizing individualistic streak. So all on psychological tests, the norm which we follow, that come from West. You say that no, you have developed norm on Indian, but it only for some kind of a formality, not in substantive sense. Norm is Indian. So only in terms of score, some kind of modification is done. But basic theory we follow from West. So it has been also written by scholars that diffusion of psychological knowledge in society. Now people, even common people talk of depression. Common people talk about, it is my life. Common people also talk that it is my identity. Common people also talk that I have to take care of my career. Now, all these things uh, come from some kind of discourse. And it is psychological discourse that have diffused. Even Gargan in that article have written that although psychology assumes that it studies a reality which is outside, which exists outside, but basically psychological knowledge which we create, it goes into society and changes the very nature of society itself. French social psychologist Serge Moscovici, he has talked of a concept of social representation. And what is theory of social representation? It is basically that how scientific knowledge becomes part of common sense. So the knowledge which we create in the discipline of psychology, it gets circulated in society and become part of common sense. And since this discipline is based on the ideology of individualism, it promotes individualistic consciousness, it legitimizes individualistic consciousness. So discipline of psychology, rather than helping a social change to occur, it is creating a tendency among people so that they cannot come together. They become individualistic.
Oh, okay, sir. Thank you so much. We are about to end this session and hope our purpose is fulfilled by your lecture. We are very thankful that you easily get ready to share all your wisdom of knowledge without any hesitation, time and again. So in future, we will again would like to invite you, and definitely we'll have an very good interactive session in future. And in fact, participants are asking about an interactive session. So let's see, we'll explore some a method, a way how can we make this session interactive. So, but for now, for today, I think this is uh, time to say good night to everyone. So, thank you so much, sir. Thank you so much. So nice of you.
Yeah, thank you. I'm sorry if I have held you back from your dinner.
No,
Not at all,
Not
sir.
at all,
Not at
sir.
all. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you.
thank you, sir. Now, so Ashwani, if any
Yeah.
announcement,
So, dear participants, there's an announcement for you. The assignment and quiz related to the today's lecture, today's sessions will be updated soon on the MOOCs platform. You will be able to see the quiz and assignment after 9:30 or maybe nearby the 10 p.m. So we would like to request you to submit your assignment and quizzes within the stipulated time frame, and it would be very even comfortable for you to go in the pace of the program, because everything has been already scheduled. So I think nobody should request any one of the organizing member to extend the last date of submission and all. So this is our humble request to be stick with the time and all, so that we can form this schedule in a strict way, and we can pursue these courses in a fruitful way. And hopefully you will understand our concern. Thank you so much for your patience and all. Over to you, Divya.
Thank you so much, participants. Let's be present again in the next session. And I hope we are going to have even more enriching sessions than the present session, and more learnings and more knowledge are coming your way in the forthcoming sessions. So good night, everyone. And take care. Stay safe.
So Omisha, now you can end this meeting.
Yeah.
So Raman. So uh, let me see. Ravinderji, are you there?
Bindu?
Ravinderji, are you there? Could you please stop this meeting?
Ravinder ji, can you listen to us?
सर मैं कॉल कर देती हूँ एक बारी.
I think we should end from our end,
Yeah.
from our side, and he will take care of the
Yeah.
rest.
I request all the participants to kindly leave the meeting from your side,
Yeah.
please.
Yeah, please.
I request all the participants to kindly leave the meeting from your side, please. Dear participants, please leave the meeting.
Ma'am,
Yeah, please.
kindly stop the live. You
So
can stop the live streaming.
okay, it cannot be possible for our side.
Yeah.
The admin can only
I
do.
think co-host. I think Divya ma'am is the co-host. She can
No,
stop
no,
the live streaming. I think.
There's
No,
no
no, it is
option
not
from
possible from our side,
our
Nirupama.
side.
I think co-host. Okay, just make me co-host. Then I can do that.
So host can only make you co-host.
Yeah.
We are not host.
Yeah. Participants are leaving. Yeah. So I don't think so there will be much of the problem. Yeah. Dear participants, please leave the meeting.
So Divya ma'am, you are the co-host. You can try stopping the live stream.
I tried, Nirupama. It is not possible from our end. It has to be done by the host only.
Even the co-host has that right. Yeah.
Dear participant, it is requested again to kindly leave this meeting. पूर्णिमा गुप्ता जी, राकेश सिंह जी, सौम्या जी, वर्षा जी, राजीव जी. Dear participants, kindly leave this meeting for the day. So now I am trying to remove the participants from this platform. Yeah, the live streaming has to end from the host side. So can you listen to us, Ravinderji? Ashwini sir, could you try contacting Ravinderji for the same?
I'm just contacting with somebody else so that we can
Yeah.
get the solution right.